I was approached by a friend several weeks ago asking me to talk about the subject of the mikveh, the ritual baths or baptism, as it's mostly known in Christian circles. And what I really did was I decided to kind of structure this lecture more in the area of trying to understand the historical background, the biblical background of the practice, but also try to understand it, how it was depicted and is used to this very day. So we're kind of going to go through a journey from very, very early antiquity, almost, I would say, almost prehistoric. Prehistoric means basically prior to any written material. If you divide up history, you kind of go prehistoric is about 3,000-4,000 BC, prior to people actually writing things. And then historic, really, when we start finding actual written material that we can try to figure out what people were doing and what they were thinking and how they lived their lives. And kind of go from there into the First Temple period. We're going to look at a whole bunch of Bible verses and end up somewhere at the end of the Second Temple. Obviously, we're going to be using Christian sources as well, because we are talking about the mikveh, and the mikveh is a pivotal point in Christian theology, but is also connected to what we know about the period as well, and kind of try to understand the background of it as well. A lot of the people that follow me are from a Christian background, so this kind of caters to them as well. The mikveh for me is actually a very practical thing. Being of Jewish descent and practicing Orthodox Judaism, I grew up with a mikveh basically just across these buildings over here. If you actually go up just a straight line from here, there's a mikveh building. And it was a place, part of my life. So it wasn't something, it wasn't this one-time thing you do in your life. You go get baptized in the Jordan River or in church or something like that. And I'm developing this contrast deliberately because you need to kind of see the difference in cultures as well. One of the major things we do a lot in biblical studies is anthropology, because when you try to go into the Bible and into history, you kind of have to separate your mind from what they lived in. It happens more than once in a classroom where a professor can be talking about something and the students are completely confused because they don't have the context of what they're actually reading. Never forgetting, we received 2 inscriptions, one from Ramses II, the other one from whatever his name was, one of the Hittite kings, and they're talking about the Battle of Kadesh, which happened in the 13th century. And they're both talking about that they both won the battle. And it's like, why are they both saying this? I mean, one of them won't admit that no, it wasn't. There are 2 possible understandings of what happened there. One is they both lost, or the other one would be it was a tie, or they're just too prideful to say that they lost. But you need to understand how these people thought, especially people back then where their kings were considered to be gods. I mean, my God fell. What does that mean? Which, by the way, is something that people struggled with in the Second Temple. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the social structure of the period. My encounter with baptism is actually a bit of a funny one. There is a site, and I hope you can hear me in the back. Okay, good. So it's a good volume. There's actually a site on the Jordan River known as Kasser el-Yahud, which is something of the Jews. I'm not too sure. And I'm not sure exactly what the translation is, but it's been developed the past couple of years. Now you can actually go. For years it was closed. These days you can go there and you can actually see it. And I went there with a couple of friends, and we go in. It's like this really nice place. The Jordan River is all messy and yucky, but because we're already in the desert part of it, so it's not as nice and clean as if you go next to Tiberias. And we're standing there, and there's this group there from the Russian Orthodox Church, and they're all dipping inside this really disgusting water. I mean, I wouldn't even dip my toes in that. And besides the embarrassment of them not realizing they're wearing white robes and nothing underneath, which was, I basically took my kids and said, okay, sweeties, look that way, okay? And, but it was the first time I actually saw a baptism. But what was interesting of this was that it wasn't the baptism I was expecting of sprinkling water on people's head. They actually went full immersion, which is, by the way, very important for our discussion as well. So that was a very interesting experience for me as well. That I lived with the mikveh my entire life, but also to actually see baptism in real life was an interesting experience, because here in Israel, there are Christian villages, you do come in contact with Christians, but you don't really get to see the culture or the life of it. So we only see it on TV. For example, you saw my was it a movie called My Big Fat Greek Wedding, something like that. They put him like this funny little rubber kiddie pool or something, and they pour water over his head. We look at that, it's kind of funny. This is kind of stupid. But when you come in contact with Christians more intimately, you kind of realize that it's a bit more serious than that, but there's also different styles. And it was actually very interesting because those are planes. For those listening, those are actually planes. We have a big military Air Force base here not too far away, so they do maneuvers every once in a while. So there's a lot of noise today, more than average. So it was very interesting to see that. The thing is that for a lot of people, baptism is a ritual you do maybe once or twice in your life. It symbolizes your acceptance of Christ as your Lord and Savior in many cultures, or your rebirth as a new Christian. Each person is a little different, each group is a little different. However, the actual practical background of the mikveh is something completely different. It actually started off as something very, very different than what most people realize. What exactly is a mikveh? The first time we hear the term mikveh is actually in Genesis. Literally in the beginning of Genesis, we actually have a description when it says that God put all the water into one place, and He names everything, and He actually refers to the body of water as a mikveh. So in verse 10 it says, and God called the dry, or the dryness, land, and to the gathering of water, the mikveh of the water, He called the seas. So a mikveh really just means a place where you gather water into one place. Now, it's very important to also understand that the first occurrence of a word in the Hebrew Bible is not the definite definition of a word. There was some church father, I think it was, that came up with this idea that to define a word correctly, you should look for the first time a word appears and say, okay, that's the definition of the word. That's an incorrect idea. Actually, James Barr, back in the 1980s, wrote a book about, it's a very widespread teaching. As a Hebrew teacher, I hear this all the time, so I have to debunk this idea. As a recommendation, there's actually a book by James Barr that deals with the definition of words, and he was one of the first English speakers to define this as being an incorrect understanding of how Hebrew works, and actually recommended for people to study things based on context. Now, when I heard this the first time, I'm like, duh, I mean, that's how you study it. But for a lot of people, this was a big surprise, especially for people outside of the Hebrew speaking world. So the thing that you basically discover is there's a lot of misconception, but this is actually a very good definition of what a mikveh is. It's a body of water. Now, usually, historically, they probably use natural bodies of water, but a mikveh today, by definition, can also be a manipulation by man. Not necessarily a person taking buckets of water and pouring it into like a swimming pool, but more that you cause the water to arrive in a specific location, and then you can use it. But we'll get to that later on, because we actually have no evidence of anything like this prior to the Second Temple period. Okay, so prior to that, we don't hear about anything used as a human manipulation of a water source. Now, the idea of going through water, if it's full immersion or just washing yourself, is actually completely connected to the idea of ritual purity and impurity. There's actually a list of impurities that appear in Numbers 19, Leviticus 15, also Leviticus 11. You have a whole list there of cases where people become ritually unclean. Now, to understand what it means to be ritually unclean is a very, very difficult subject. I've attempted to kind of give like a physical definition of the subject. It's very difficult. The one thing that was interesting that came up when I was researching this was the connection to death. that death is like the antithesis of life and the antithesis of God. So death is like something that is attracted to this physical world. It connects to us, and we're trying to remove it. Now, removing contact with the dead is a much more complex process than just going through water. There's sprinkling with the ashes of the red heifer. Do not ask me how the ashes of a dead animal purify you from the dead. It's one of the enigmas of Torah. But the most simple process that everyone anyhow has to go through is to go through water. Now, water has a very, very powerful symbolic meaning in the ancient world. In a lot of creation stories, including the Torah, we have depictions of the world coming out through water. So going through water, being touched by water, coming in contact with water, is something that was used in the ancient world to symbolize rebirth, to symbolize a reconnection with the more primeval part of mankind, a reconnection to the divine. I mean, for example, in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian, actually started off as a Sumerian, then became Babylonian creation story. The god Marduk becomes king by defeating Epsu and Tiamat. Tiamat is the goddess of salt water. Epsu is the god of sweet water. He defeats both of them. Tiamat is the more fierce one. So interesting, the female character is the fierce one. And in the ancient world, by the way, they didn't have gender segregation. They actually there were goddesses, and there is actually more than that. If you go to Egyptian iconography, some of the earlier stages, you can actually see, if you go behind, you see the pharaoh and his wife with their arms around one another in the back, which depicts the idea that basically to be a real king, you actually have to have your wife. The segregation against women really began with the church, but that's a different lecture. Very different lecture, but I recommend, there's a few things you can read about this, but the thing was that basically people looked at water as a source of life, as a symbol of life. So what's the best thing to depict the world coming into existence and man re-emerging as a new being is through water. Also think about it, you know, we were all born, how we were born, through water as well. Everything is fluids, everything is liquids, but more importantly, and even now there was a few cases now of babies born inside the actual sac that you can actually see them wrapped inside it. There was one case in Spain a couple of weeks ago. Man is born through water. You know, you always have the water, my water dropped. You know, there's a very, very big connection here to water, to rebirth of man, for becoming a new person. You can go from there to understand what happened later on, but we're not going to jump ahead. Now, why do you need to keep yourself pure? There's actually a very practical side to this. It wasn't just, oh, I want to feel closer to God. There was also an issue of, okay, you can't go into the temple without being clean. You know, you by going into the temple, you're defiling the temple, but also what you're doing is you're creating a barrier between you and God. Now, that's the main place where you actually have to keep yourself pure. So in Numbers 5, verses 1 to 4, we actually have a command there to, especially the priests and the Levites, so my ancestors and my cousins, to keep anyone who's unclean away from the temple. The encampment actually of the Israelites, if we start now from the point where they began, if we think about the encampment, there were three camps, the three basic camps. There was the camp of the Israelites, there was the camp of the Levites, and then in the center you actually had the temple itself. Now, in the desert, what they actually did is you had to keep yourself a minimal amount of cleanliness inside the camp, even inside the Israelite camp. Today, everyone thinks, oh, the temple itself, you go to Jerusalem, you go to the Temple Mount. Actually, in the desert, they had to keep the encampment itself clean. Anyone who was unclean had to walk outside of the camp. This was an everyday life thing. Obviously, there were different levels. Like inside the camp, you were allowed to be unclean. You were allowed to be unclean, but what's forbidden is lepers, for example, which again, leprosy, symbolic of death. When King Uzziyahu whatever you call him in English. Uziyahu, Azariyahu, he appears in different names. He got leprosy. He went into the temple. He wanted to offer an offering inside the temple itself. Leprosy grew up on his forehead. It only appears in Chronicles. How do you call Uziyahu in English? I'm trying to remember.
Azazel? Azazel?
No, Azazel is something different.
Okay.
I don't remember, but I did read that not too long ago.
Yeah, and
Do you know where the reference
could be.
is?
No, I'm actually pulling this out of my head. But the thing was that when he received the leprosy, he actually lived in the cemetery. His son Jotham or Yotam took over. If you actually look at the first verses of Isaiah, you should have his name there.
King Uzziah.
Uzziah, exactly, King Uzziah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I don't like using English names because they're just sometimes they're completely off. And he lived in the cemetery, and there was a reason for that, because of the leprosy. He was a leper for life. He was king for a very, very long time. He couldn't function as king, and he moved his residency into the cemetery. So lepers are not allowed inside the most basic camp. But other types of impurities, and for the sake of keeping this kind of clean, you just can look at the verses, but there are different reasons for people to become unclean. Menstrual cycle, which I think is okay to mention, but there are other actions which are more sexual that can cause uncleanliness, and these people sometimes have to walk out of the camp, depending which part of the camp, but there are different levels. This, by the way, causes a little bit of confusion as well, because you read about what was going on in the desert, and you start thinking, oh, it's just the same thing in Jerusalem. No, Jerusalem and the encampment in the desert are two separate things. When you study the Torah and you study different things that have to do specifically with the encampment, you have to separate that from what you do in everyday life. I've met people who try to practice different ritual practices of pure and impurity outside of the principle of Jerusalem or outside of the principle of the desert encampment, and they make their lives a little miserable because they're trying to keep things that you don't really come on to do outside of the temple. So, for example, in everyday life, the only real reason for a person to keep the purity laws is mostly, and especially today when we have no sacrifices, no temple, is mostly for marriage, for marital relations. That, a man and a woman are not allowed to be together if the woman's on her cycle. That is the only actual reason today for anyone to actually go to the mikveh under these rules, under the practices of the Torah. If you do go up to the Temple Mount, if you do decide to do this, by the way, you should go through some kind of purification, and I'll explain some more details about this. But it seems to be mostly when it comes to sacrifices, eating the sacrifices, because there are sacrifices the person is allowed to eat, like for example peace offerings. You read the first couple chapters 1 to 4 of Leviticus, you see all the offerings there. There are offerings which are only eaten by the priests, the chatat and the asham, which are more sin offerings or really more cleansing offerings. But there's shlamim, there's the peace offerings, which you actually eat as a type of, how would I put it? It is considered by many scholars to be kind of a meal you share with God. It's a way of becoming close to God. So you give part of it to the temple. The Kohanim, the priests, eat it because God does not actually eat. We only burn parts of the offerings completely, and then the priests, as representatives of God, eat the sacrifice, and you take your portion. You actually go and eat it. For example, in the excavations of Shiloh, one of the things I heard, I haven't read the actual descriptions, but one of the people who works there told me that they found a lot of pottery around the area, and finding broken pottery, actually deliberately smashed pottery, is an indication that they were actually eating all the way around the area, around the mountains, and as long as they could see the tabernacle, they were allowed to eat their sacrifices. And they smashed the pots because the Torah says that anything after 3 days you're not supposed to eat it, which includes the pot, because the pot absorbs. They used to use clay pots to cook. Have you ever seen what is it called, a tijan, I think? It's like these clay pots and they're cooking them. It's more of an Arabian thing. It's the same idea. They used clay pots, they put on fires, they absorb them, so they actually smash them. And you can see the deliberate smashing of all these pots all over the area. It's pretty amazing. So seeing Torah alive in archaeology, which is, by the way, a very rare thing, and you understand why it's so rare. The only people that we actually find in the Torah that are supposed to keep this pureness, this cleanliness all the time, are only priests, because they're supposed to be functional people throughout the day. Many of them would live in the area of the temple. Or if we take another theory, like for example the theory by Menachem Haran, for example, that there were actually more than one ritualistic centers. So they had to keep themselves clean all the time. You have a question? No, the subject about temples is a complex one. It does not seem that there was only one temple. We're led to believe, from the perspective of the Temple of Jerusalem, that there's only one temple. In reality, and this is part of the criticism of the prophets, there were more than one temple. There were probably dozens of them all over. And in the north, most definitely. They had more than Dan and Bet El, as Jeroboam built. There were actually more places. It's very interesting. There's the insert in the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, or Bel. Actually, Bel and Baal are two separate things. Do not confuse them. Baal is one thing, Bel is another version. Baal is the Canaanite version of the name. Bel is the Babylonian god. But they have very close names. In any case, he mentions there the demolished altar of God. Why is there a demolished altar of God on Mount Carmel, which is just, by the way, just over here? Because it seems to be that there was a ritualistic center. There was actually some kind of a small temple there, and Elijah goes and rebuilds it, which is very interesting. But it's a very, very complex subject, which we don't have the time for. Okay, so we've established that you use water. But the question is, how do you use this water? Now, if you go to any Orthodox Jew today, they'll tell you, oh yeah, it's full immersion in a natural or quasi-natural source of water. Quasi is that we use drainage and ice and stuff like that to melt. If you take a block of ice and it's solid, it's no longer water, it's ice. So if you dunk it into like a pool, it's natural. Yeah, I'm not going to go into the logic of that. But in any case, what they do today is they use drainage from rainwater, and they store it in a special place. When we talk about the structure of the mikveh, we can get to that. But the question is, how does one exactly purify oneself? In the Torah, we actually have three terms used in purification. The main one is from the word rachatz, which really just means to wash. It's no different than just walking to your shower and having a shower. You know? The term rachatz is to wash oneself, but it's also kind of a bit more of a scrubbing as well. You're actually cleaning yourself. Okay? This is a term that's used over and over again. But if you ask most Orthodox Jews, they'll tell you rachatz is the same as full immersion. Okay? They'll tell you there's no difference between rachatz and the term taval. Taval is full immersion. However, we never see that term used ever when it comes to people purifying themselves, except for one thing. It says that when a Kohen, when it talks about leprosy, which should be, if I remember correctly, in Leviticus, it talks about the lepers. Oh, there it is. And when it talks about, it's Leviticus 14, verse 6, he takes a bird, which is a symbol of freedom. When you're leper, you're incarcerated in the leprosy. It represents freedom. You take a tree. It should be, I think it's a cypress or something, which represent growth and life. But then you also take a piece of wool dyed red. Red represents life as well. You know, when you don't have redness in your cheeks, then you presumably are very sick. But then it says he dips them v'tavalotam. This is the only case we actually see the term taval, where if he takes these things, he actually immerses them into the blood of the other bird. He has water, and he has a little bit of blood in there because he takes two birds. He slaughters one of the birds into the water, and that's the only case where you hear he dips and then he sprinkles onto the person who was healed from leprosy. It's a complex, it's a very unusual ritual. It's a very interesting ritual as well. It's a subject for another discussion, but it's the only case where we hear, it's the only real situation when we hear the actual term taval. The other term that we have is rechitza or rachatz, and rachatz is, shataf. The shtifa is just basic rinsing. It's not, it appears a couple of times in the Tanakh as a word, and mostly it appears as something, just rinse something out. Like for example, when they defeated the Midianites, they took vessels from them, different bowls and cups and stuff, and it says that they had to wash them. It wasn't a serious washing. So we have these three basic terms which are used to define cleanliness or how you go through a process. But what's interesting is the repeating of the term rachatz. Now, how do we know rachatz is actually just washing oneself? First of all, we have to ask a very simple question. Where would they have a large body of water in the desert? For example, when the priests were dedicated, for example, it's repeated twice, once in Numbers 40 verse 12 and the other one in Leviticus 8:6, it mentions that they washed themselves. So I remember my kids came back with a pamphlet for Yom Kippurim last year for Day of Atonement, and there was a picture there of the high priest is like as if sitting inside this puddle of water in the middle of the desert. I'm like, this is nonsense. They wouldn't do that. The water probably came from the lever. They actually had a large copper or bronze basin that they would just take water out of that and pour upon themselves. It wasn't done by actually immersing oneself in the desert. I mean, there's really not too many water sources. The Levites go through something very similar as well. But what's very interesting is the case of Bathsheba. Bathsheba is very interesting. It describes that she goes up onto the roof and she's washing herself. Now, people back then, today we kind of live inside closed quarters and everything. Back then, people mostly lived in their front yard. I mean, that's where people lived. They lived in their front yard. You cooked there. That's where your kitchen was. And inside the house was where you slept. And when you did everything, your laundry you took to the river. But you did everything in the shared quarters by everyone, and you slept inside your house. Now you want to take a shower, you can't go to the water source because, well, people are going there to collect their water to drink. You're not going to strip naked and dunk into the what everyone's supposed to drink from. It's kind of disgusting. Even back then they thought it was disgusting. Also, when you go to Jerusalem, you'll see that if you go through the water works there, or any water works, Gezer as well, you can't jump into the water there. It's dangerous. You actually lower a bucket to pull out your water, or a jar or something. So where do you go? You go to your roof. You wash yourself on your roof. But you can say, oh, she's just taking a shower. No, she's on the roof. She has some kind of curtains up or something. If she lived there, she was probably wealthy, so she probably had money for curtains, because you couldn't live in the capital if you were poor. If you live near the capital, in tents maybe. But so she's up on the roof. King David goes out and he sees her, and what's very interesting is the fact that the text actually mentions that after, there's actually an insertion of information there in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Let me go there for a second. No, it's over here. Chapter 11, verse 2 and then verse 4. So verse 4 says, and it was towards the evening, which is very interesting. Why specifically the evening? What, because there's a nice breeze? First of all, yes, there's a wonderful breeze in Jerusalem around towards sunset because of the change of the pressures, the air pressure. But what's also very important here is this specific time is also a time when people go in to do their purification. Why? Because it says, if I remember correctly, it should be in Numbers, it says that the sun has to set and only then the person is pure, or only then the person is clean. So what's the best time to do it? You take your shower, you take your bath before sunset. The word erev is from the Akkadian arbu, which means to set, or actually means to enter, and it's used to indicate the entering of the sun into its place of dwelling, because they actually believed the earth was flat back then. We're not going to go into flat earth. We're not going to do that. But I remember mentioning this once, and people, oh really? So they believe in flat earth? And I said, yeah, but it doesn't prove anything. In any case, you've read those theories, you've heard of them. There's like videos all over YouTube. But then what's interesting, what happens in verse 4, in the second half of verse 4, it says, and he laid with her, and she was sanctifying herself for her impurity. Now, this is why mention this? He should have said that he laid with her, and then he sent her back home. Why do we have this insertion of information about her purifying herself from her impurity? So there are two possibilities here. One is intercourse causes people to become unclean, but what's the point of washing yourself immediately after that? Because because people used to take showers and then oil themselves. That was the body cream that they had back then. That's number one. Number two, it's already nighttime, so what's the point? Wait till the next day and then purify yourself. So this seems to be a little bit, the way it seems in the Hebrew at least is it's out of place. It sometimes happens the text throws information here and there as a unnatural adding of information, and it seems to me at least, and there are loads of scholars who agree with this, that you are looking at a hint here that what she actually was doing on the roof, she was purifying herself after having her menstrual cycle, and which means that there's a good chance she was actually ovulating as well, which would explain how we know that that she became pregnant. It was actually from David. Now David was trying to hide the fact that she was pregnant. He brought back her husband Uriah. We're not going to go into this whole question of what do you mean he laid with a married woman. That's a capital punishment. That's a capital crime. In any case, it seems to be that she was practicing the ritual bath after, or the ritual cleansing after her menstrual cycle. So this can be an indication of how they practiced it, which meant they went towards the evening, they found some water, and they just washed themselves on the roof. You can't build a mikveh on a roof, especially not back then, because back then the roofs were usually made out of wood. You throw some clay on top, maybe some straw. Stone roofs were very, very expensive. Most archaeological sites, when you find a building with a roof, that's very, very unusual. It means whoever built it was a genius. Most places the roof is the first thing to go. And in many cases the roof was actually made just of very simple substances. So you can't really build a ritual bath on such a thing. You have to remember, to fully immerse yourself, you have to have something which is big enough for the average human. That requires a very, very small swimming pool or a jacuzzi or something like that. And you can't really build that on the roof. And it seems to be very clear that this is what she was doing. Now there are a few other cases as well of people purifying themselves. Like for example, the case of Naaman, who was the Aramean warlord. Actually, no, he was more of a general. He was a general of Chazael. But what's very interesting there is that this is 2 Kings chapter 5. So he gets leprosy, and his wife's handmaid says to her mistress, there's a prophet in Israel. He can help your husband. And he goes there and he tells him, go and v'rachatzta, go and wash yourself. The prophet Elisha actually uses the verb to wash, rachatz, the same verb we hear over and over again when someone's supposed to purify oneself in the Torah. Now here he hears this, he gets really angry. You have to understand this. This prophet of this God that only a few people worship is telling him to go wash himself in this drizzle of a river, in this really small country. Tell him, go wash yourself, you'll be fine. He's like, no way. We have great rivers up in our lands in Syria. He says to him in verse 12, Evna and Parpar, the rivers of Damascus are better than all the waters of Israel. Which is, by the way, true. He's not lying. He's telling the truth. This is not a river. Put it this: I grew up here in Israel. The first time I actually saw a real river was when I was in a car driving from Massachusetts to New York, and there was this river there, and my dad looks at this river and he says to me, "You think that's a river? Wait for it." My parents moved to the United States, so I went to visit them, and truly, about a year and a bit later, I actually went I stayed in Virginia, and we were traveling from Virginia into Washington itself, and we're driving on this bridge, and I'm like, "Is the bridge over?" And this thing went on for a while, and I'm like, I peek out the car, and I was like, "Okay, that's a river." So you think about it, a man lives in a small country, you don't really see large cities. I mean, the first time I went to London, for example, my family's from England, I'm like, "Oh, I can walk it." And my aunt looks at me, "You can't walk it." It's like, "What do you mean you cannot walk?" I mean, I actually went on the tube from the center of London, and I went all the way up to the most northern neighborhood of London in a tube, which means you only stop for about 30 seconds or 45 seconds per station. And I traveled from the center of London, from the main train station, all the way to, I can't remember what the name of the neighborhood is, and it took about an hour and 20 minutes to get just from the center of the city in the underground with very few stops, all the way to the most, and you think about it, if you walk from one end to the other, it'll probably take you an entire day, if not more. So you think about small countries, you go and they tell you, "Oh yeah, we got this olive oil here we produce in our country. Here, take that, and this will heal everything that you have." The guy's like, "What are you talking about? We have like orchards the size of your country." He's like, "No, this is special." And that's what they're trying to teach him. But so he hears this, he responds like that, so he gets really upset. So his servants say to him, "No, Lord, he said something great, go do it." And what is his actual response? He says, "You know what? I'm not just going to wash myself. I'm going to actually fully immerse myself." And it actually says in verse 14, it says in verse 13, "For he said to you, go and rechatz, wash yourself and purify." So it says, and he went down and he vayitbol, he uses a completely different verse, he fully immerses himself. Now, I asked most of my friends, I asked them what they think about it. They say, "Oh no, it means that rachatz and taval are the same." I said, "No, you're not getting the motion of what he's going through. He's angry." He says, "What do you mean I'm going to dip myself in this little thing you have here?" He says, "You know what, it's not going to work. I'm going to immerse myself completely." It kind of reminds me, I don't know, some movie references here today. If you've ever seen Pirates of the Caribbean, there's a scene there where they're trying to bring themselves back to life because they're all zombies or whatever. And they cut the girl's hand and they put the blood and they throw it in, it doesn't work. So when the guy says, "Let's pour all of her blood for good measure," it's kind of like the same idea what he's saying here. So he goes in, he anyhow is purified, but you kind of have to read between the lines of what was going on. So another place where we see a contrast. However, here's the problem. The Tanakh, the Bible, and I prefer to use the word Tanakh. When you say Bible, for most people it means Old Testament and New Testament. For me, it only means the Old Testament, so I use the term Tanakh to refrain from confusion. But because the New Testament is full of depictions of Torah keeping during the times of Jesus, Yeshua. Which one do you prefer, Jesus or Yeshua? Yeshua. Okay. The previous group wanted Jesus. No, they wanted Yeshua as well. I've met people say, "Oh, we prefer the term Jesus." So it's full of depictions of what people were doing. I mean, it was I'm taking a course now about Christianity, and we're talking about Torah keeping and everything. And there's maybe a few interesting things I might surprise you with today. You enjoying this? It's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So where was I now? So the problem we have with it's mostly for the comic relief. I believe in being funny during a lecture because it wakes people up. So one of the things that we have in the Torah, in the rest of the Nevi'im and Ketuvim, the prophets and the writings, is we have very few references to actual Torah keeping. So we need to kind of read between the lines. We also have to understand that we're going through a struggle, so the focus is more, are they keeping the covenant? Are they being true to God? Not, did they pray this morning, or did they keep kosher? I mean, there are some references to people not keeping kosher. For example, in the end, kosher being the, sometimes you term to me, I'm not so sure what they are. You know what kosher is, right? Yeah. Okay. So kosher is a very, very late term. It's actually borrowed from Persian. It means something which is acceptable. It just means clean. In Daniel, I think the description in Daniel is the best, where he says we will not defile ourselves with the bread of the king, pat bagamelech, which probably was more of also something more ritualistic. It wasn't just regular bread. It was bread that was offered to gods. Even if it was clean, if it was bread and some meat, and because back then they didn't have all the rules that we have today. It's like, oh, it's not kosher meat. A rabbi didn't slaughter this animal. Or some people say a rabbi blessed it, which is just nonsense. If everyone tells you it's kosher because a rabbi blessed it, know one thing: nonsense. That's not what makes something kosher. But I have to deal with this every once in a while. I've had this so many times, it's hilarious. But a rabbi blessed it. It's like, no, it doesn't work like that. But in any case, we have very few depictions because the focus is very, very specific. I think some of the people really brought this to light. I mean, though I disagree with their theories, is people like Martin Knott, people who were dealing more with the theories of the Hexateuch and the Pentateuch and the connections between the Torah and the prophets and the editing. I'm doing big quotation marks as if there was editing and things like that. They actually show you the focus of what these parts of the books are really talking about. So some good things do come out of these Bible scholars. Some of them are bad, some of them are good. You know, we take the good, we get rid of the bad, and that's basically it. There's very, very little depiction of it. And but that's actually very important because the problem that they were having in the first temple was a lack of loyalty. So let me transition you now. 386, actually no, by 609 the Babylonians defeat the Assyrians. They take over the Assyrian Empire. They have struggles with Pasemtich, I don't know if I call him in English, but Pasemtich, one of the pharaohs. There's an ongoing struggle between Egypt and Babylon. The Judeans are torn between them. There was a facet of Judeans in Jerusalem who wanted to support the Babylonians. There was a group that wanted to support the Egyptians. There was an internal struggle. Zedekiah, being the weak king that he was not groomed to be king. So he was a very, very weak character. Is in the end defeated. The Babylonians take over. The hope over Egypt is like Jeremiah describes him as a cane that breaks and pierces the hands of the people who hold it. And Jerusalem is taken over, destruction, and people are saying, they're going like, but what about the covenant? What about the house of David? What about our right to live in this land? What about God? Where is God in this entire picture? And Jeremiah is standing there saying, I've been talking with you for years now, you haven't been listening. This is what happens. People come back after officially 586 in the usual, the regular reconstruction of chronology is when Jerusalem is destroyed. By 538 they start returning. Now it's very important to understand the timeline here as well. From 538 BC to the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, what appears in the Ezra books and is Nehemiah, there's several decades. The book is very confused when it comes to timeline. There's several decades going on there. And what we end up with is a very, very confused group of Jews, or Judeans. I don't want to use the term Jews because it was either the Romans who used the term Jews. Prior to that, people called themselves either Judeans or Israelites. The reason they use the term Israelites is because the land was not empty. There were, I think they're deliberately making tons of noise just to disturb this. The fact remains that many of the 10 tribes remained here. Many Jews today are descendants of the 10 tribes. Some of them were lost. There are people out there, and maybe someone here as well carries a genetic imprint of those people as well, that were lost, that they were kind of swallowed into the mountains, the Zigris mountains, and the Assyrian, what was left of Assyria, what was left of Babylon, and so on, and what was left of all the little tribes all over the place. But at the end of the day, the majority of the tribes remained here. Oded Lifshitz, there's actually a lecture on YouTube of Oded Lifshitz, which is a summary of his big book. There's like a 500-page book in Hebrew. If you translate it in English, it would probably be around the area of 800. I'm actually reading his book at the moment. Where he explains there was a myth that the land was empty. And why was there a myth that the land was empty? Is because we had several different groups struggling with one another over who is the real Israel. Sounds familiar? And the problem was that they were all defining what Torah was and what was to be an Israelite different from one another. So there's a group living here in the land who were people who remained here under the Assyrian occupation, under the Babylonian occupation, and they just kept whatever they knew. They had everything they knew was oral. They probably had no Torah scrolls. If they had anything, maybe bits and pieces of it. And they just lived their lives and they remembered more or less what their ancestors did. Yes?
The prophecy was that they were going to be scattered to the four corners of the earth. So, was that prophecy true?
Oh, it was most definitely true.
Then
Because-
how could they still be in Israel?
Okay, so part of them were scattered. Okay, it wasn't everyone. I mean, we have to look at the exact wording there if it means everyone. If I remember correctly, it does not say everyone. But people were scattered. I mean, by this point, they were probably scattered in what was the known world of back then, because people went up into Syria. I mean, by this point, around the 3rd century, you hear about Jewish communities living in Asia Minor, almost in Rome. You have Jews in Carthage. You have, New Carthage, which is North Africa. They were basically the four corners of the known world back then. So that it did happen around that time. You have to move around, but at the end of the day, they did end up all over the world. You had a question?
What was the name of that, the man who wrote the book?
Oded Lifshitz.
Can you spell that for me?
Oded is O-D-E-D. Lifshitz, I think, is Lipsitz, I think. We can look up his name later on, and I'll get the book and we can see the spelling of his name. So everyone was very confused here, but there was a much more important part: the issue of sin, the issue of trying to repair what happened. And I think that was I think even to this very day, it's a main theme in Judaism and in Christianity. I mean, probably more in Christianity than Judaism, but that's because it was promoted by the church as well. I think Yeshua was more about keep the covenant and don't sin, but people sin. It's a reality. But it's a different discussion about what did Yeshua really preach. But what they were dealing with was a problem. They're standing here. There's the house of David, but there's no actual king. There's a temple, but we're not really seeing all these things that were promised. So there must be something wrong. We must be doing something wrong. So they realized that the problem is something to do with sin. So they were looking for ways to overcome this problem. And one of the things that developed was changing certain rules. For example, we have the whole story with Ezra keeping away all the foreign women. All these women they married. First of all, many of these women were probably not as foreign as we think they were. And also they more or less failed with these reforms. But what you see here is attempts to increase the volume of Torah. If the Torah says don't marry the 7 nations who lived in your land because they can corrupt you, he extended this to everyone. Anyone who's not an Israelite. So what we see in this period is an overextension of Torah commandments. What is a thing that keeps you away from God, keeps you away from His temple? Anyone? Wild guess? Keeps you away from the temple? Being unclean, exactly. Being unclean. So they exaggerated it. They exaggerated the idea. So what we start seeing here in the literature of the time is this increase of purification. An interesting case is the story of Judith. Have you ever heard the book of Judith? The story goes there that she, first of all, mentions the tribe of Simon, by the way, which is interesting. But they're dealing with some invasion. It talks about the times of King Nebuchadnezzar. By the way, his name wasn't Nebuchadnezzar. That's it's shorthand of his name. His name was Nebu Isu. Very, very long name. Quite a few syllables. It was like Nebu Isu Azu something Nasar at the end. It's like 10 or 15 syllables in his name. Nebuchadnezzar is the shortened version of his name. Actually, by the way, it's Nebuchadrezzar. It's actually with an R, not a D. The D is it's a transition between Hebrew and Babylonian. So we say it with a D, and they actually said it with an R. So there's a few places in the Bible where it actually appears with an R, not a D. But in any case, in the story there, she's putting herself in danger and she's trying to save her people, and she prays a lot. But what does she do before she prays? Also, by the way, praying. In the Torah, there is no commandment to pray. Prayer was a spontaneous thing people did when they need to talk with God. Prayer was, hey, I'm down here. It wasn't anything formulaic. This is also the period we start seeing the composition of the book of Psalms. Collecting all these Psalms that people knew and putting them into some kind of organized book. A lot of theories about the book of Psalms, but that's the time for this. It's a recommendation. Movenkel, there's a scholar called, I think his name was Herman Movenkel. There's like this big book, you can buy it off of Amazon. He gives his own theory about the book of Psalms. There's loads and loads of books about it. But in this period, more Psalms, we hear more about prayer, but we also hear about people purifying themselves left, right, and center. This is what she does. She goes and washes herself before she prays, and she prays every night. She goes out of the camp, she goes to some body of water, not a mikveh, she actually goes to a body of water, she immerses herself. This is where we start seeing this full immersion practice. She goes and she prays, and then she goes back to the camp she's in. Also, she's not willing to pray in the camp because there's idols there. Okay? And what happens around this period, around the 2nd century BC, is we start seeing these actual structures, these buildings, people digging holes into the ground and setting stairs, and we start seeing what we know today as a mikveh. Have you gone to the city of David yet? Okay, when you go to the city of David, especially if you go to the archaeological dig, the Robinson Center, you can actually see these, and there's loads and loads of them, all these baths, some of them very, very big. There's the famous stair bath, which basically have stairs everywhere, and all of them go down, and it ends with like this hole in the middle. There's a bit of a debate there if this was for washing yourself or washing your vessels. It's too big and too public for people to strip naked and go in. So it seems to me this was more something you would use to wash your vessels, and it's so big because you come with your vessels, you want to do it quickly, and a lot of people are doing it simultaneously. But we start seeing these actual structures, and I actually have a few pictures here that I can show you guys. Let's see if I can find it. Here's a good one. I don't know if you can see it, so you can pass it around. You got yourselves. You see a structure that can be one set of stairs, it can be two set of stairs, it can be a set of stairs with a divider in between, loads and loads of things. But this is where we start seeing these baths. Now, what's very interesting is it's quite probable, and this was suggested by a friend of mine, it's quite probable that they started building these things because of the Roman baths. That the Romans, they developed the whole bath thing, they developed the whole aqueduct practice, and they built their own baths, and this was probably an influence. Prior to that, you just washed yourself, you went to some source of water, you went in, you came out, all clean-ish, and not in our standards clean, but clean, pure, and this is a period where they actually say Partzata Rabbi Israel, cleanliness or purity started bursting in Israel. Everyone was practicing this. Everyone was keeping making sure they're clean. There is a lot of research about these mikvot, about these structures, because they're trying to understand the composition of practice inside the structure of society. So I think a lot of people has read Josephus, at least a little bit, and Josephus describes several groups in the land of Israel. He mentions 3 main groups, though I believe there were a lot more than that. But 3 main groups: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. The Essenes being the more extreme group of the 3. Pharisees and Sadducees were actually arguing with one another over what does it mean to be pure. They both used the ritual bath, but each one of them had a different opinion of how it's supposed to be structured. So there's a technical thing here. The Sadducees believed that it has to be one bath and that was it. The Pharisees believed that you actually had to have a secondary structure. And the secondary structure, what it enabled them to do was to change the water in the main bath and keep the water in the other bath as well. So they believed that you can turn water that you drew with your buckets and pour it on the ground, let the water kind of seep in, kind of slowly drizzle into your bath. They believed that that was actually acceptable. We can actually look at the image here. But you also had to have another source of water next to it, connected with a small pipe that enabled the waters to connect to one another, turning the drawn water into as if it's natural water. So by digging in these sites and finding these different places, especially Qumran, which is the one of the more important sites for us, especially understanding the composition of the society at the time, they discovered that, for example, in Qumran, they refused to accept the way the Pharisees understood the law, and their pools actually were built as one pool with no extra piping, nothing connecting to other places. But what's very interesting is everyone was doing this. Every person was practicing this because this was the norm. But at this time, it's where we start seeing a change. Actually, no, it's changing in a second. What is the basic structure? This is something a bit more technical. The basic structure has to contain anything between, I'm going to say this in liters, I don't know what it will be in gallons, but anything between 331 liters to 648. Today, most people do 1,000 liters to just, cover us from all ends. But the whole idea is it has to be big enough for the average person, meaning not me and not you, to be able to immerse themselves fully by just basically going in. Okay? If you don't have enough water inside, it becomes disqualified. They actually measured. There was actually a rabbi who was an expert in these structures, how they're done in modern days, and he went with a special measuring stick, and he came out smiling, saying, "These are amazing. They're perfect." So he said he basically deemed them all kosher. But what's interesting as well is that in some places, for example, they prefer to connect the pool to an aqueduct, which means you're actually connected directly to a fountain or a natural source of water. It seems the Sadducees preferred this. Later on in time, the Roman baths, when Jerusalem was destroyed, but the Romans were controlling the area, financially it was worth their while to connect directly to the aqueduct and keep the piping connected to the pool itself, so even Jews would come and wash in their baths. So they actually find stories in Talmudic and Mishnaic sources where rabbis and different people are going to these Roman bathhouses to purify themselves. Because they were still keeping a lot of different practices, and we'll get to that in a moment. Now what's very interesting, now we're going to start talking a little bit more about Yeshua and the practices at his time. So what we find at this period as well is the Essenes, or the people living in Qumran. And what was found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls is this prayer, this blessing. It's called, I don't know if translate the blessing to the purifier, or the blessing for the person purifying. And there's like different, blessed you are. It doesn't say Lord, it actually says El. It seems to be the refrain from using the name. King, God of the world, and so on. And they have these different requests there for the person to receive, purity and different things. They were already treating the going through the mikveh not only as a social, not only as a Torah practice, but also something which became their identity. Same way, for example, today in Christianity, you have to be baptized. It's an issue of identity. It's the same thing. There's David Flusser, who wrote also in English. He spoke a lot about the Jewish origins of Christianity. There are a lot of things that are done in the church which are very similar to the mindset of people during the Second Temple period. I actually once lamented and said, one of the sad things is Christianity picked up some of the worst things that were going on back then and adopted it themselves. They took a lot of the really, really bad things, the sectarianism, the fighting, the lack of definition. but it became a symbol of your sect. So for example, the Essenes were considered to be the most extreme because they washed themselves before everything they did. They washed themselves before meals, they washed themselves before they prayed, they washed themselves before they read from the scriptures. Everything. They had to have a functioning source of water all the time, and they went through it all the time. And this little prayer that they discovered is very interesting because it contains a lot of the ideology of coming closer to God, being part of the chosen people of God. These people believed in determinism. They believed that you either are from the sons of light or the sons of darkness, and they had these different tests. They would reject people based on if you had hair on your shoulders, for example. You had to be at least 6 parts light to join the group. If you were 6 part darkness or 5, even half and half, you were rejected. There's a description. Yeah, there's a description of how it worked. So this was a big thing for their identity. Now the theory is, there's this theory that John the Baptist, Yochanan HaMatbil as we call him in Hebrew, was in touch with the Essenes for a while. And that's where he got his baptism idea from. Now, again, everyone had baptism back then, but the idea of baptism as something that is no longer a purification to become clean, as the Torah ascribes, but more as a practice of showing your devotion to God and doing a spiritual transformation. So the Miqveh or the ritual bath becomes from now on a symbol of transition. It is a transitional ceremony, and therefore is no longer under the strict rules of what the Torah ascribes as being the way you're supposed to purify yourself. So are you fully immersed? You're only washing yourself, pouring over your head. It didn't mean anything by that point, especially what John the Baptist was doing. My father claims that he was actually running a mikveh. I am not convinced of that. I think that he was probably just doing something very symbolic. And you actually see, when you go through the New Testament, you see the cases where, especially with Yeshua, when he baptizes him, it's more symbolic. The dove appears out of heaven. This is in some of the synoptic gospels. This is the point where he changes. You take I think it's I'm not a New Testament scholar, but I think Matthew is the one that has the virgin birth. So it's a predetermined disposition of being the Messiah. But in other sources, because even though the New Testament that we have today was tampered and was touched by the church, there's some ideology there. For example, if you take the description in Josephus about Yeshua, and you read that, it sounds like he's the Messiah. He's most definitely the Messiah. He was predetermined to be the Messiah and everything. But there's actually a very similar description that might be even earlier from an Arab Christian from around the 5th or 6th century. I can't remember his name. His name was like Gepsu or Gepos. I can't remember his name at the moment. And he gives a very different idea of it. There's no predetermination. It seems to be more that it was the baptism that made him into the Messiah. And it's a very, very different way of looking at things. But this is very pivotal for understanding the culture of the time. It wasn't just going through water to purify yourself. It became very symbolic. And this is why in the New Testament, the baptism is the pivotal point, because that's the transformation. When people went to John the Baptist, they went through, and what they wanted to do was to symbolize their redevotion to God, or as people call it today, their rebirth. It wasn't just, we're going to go to the mikveh. It received a very, very, very different idea to it. Now, in parallel to that, in the this, by the way, was mainstream. It had nothing to do with Christianity. People were just going there. This was a mainstream. Everyone was following this. A lot of people were just going to symbolize their redevotion to God. But what we see here is this complete movement, still keeping the ideas of the biblical purity, but moving away from that, creating symbolism, which was very, very common at the time. Allegoric meaning of things, symbolism, everything kind of travels away from its practical, everyday life, normal thing that you wake up in the morning and you put on your prayer shawl and you go out to your field and you work and you tithe and you give to the Levites and to the priest and to the Kohen, and you keep your kosher food or your clean food. It was this people. This was part of the covenant. By this point, it was changing. People were moving more into symbolism. People were moving more into the allegoric meaning of things because they were struggling with one very simple thing. Where is God? We're not seeing the physical promises that we were given when we came out of Egypt. So people were moving into a more spiritual idea. We start hearing about heaven and hell at this time. We start hearing about that the punishment to the wicked and the reward to the righteous happens in another plane, not in this physical world. In the Torah, it's on this physical plane. If you're wicked, you're punished on this earth. If you're righteous, you receive your reward here. When you die, you go down to Sheol and you go to sleep. That's how it's depicted in the Bible. You go to the story about Samuel when he's called out by the witch. They call it the witch of Endor. You know, he says, "Why have you awakened me? Why have you brought me up here?" It was a very, very common belief in the ancient Near East to say, when you die, you go to sleep. Heaven, hell is on this earth. You go to the last several verses in Isaiah, the wicked will be resurrected, the righteous will be resurrected, the wicked will be punished in eternal fire. But that eternal fire is in this earth, nowhere else. It's nowhere else. So they moved, everything started moving in this period. We actually can see it in the literature. Yeah.
There's a place in the New Testament where Yeshua is about to ascend, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it was just before he was going to go for the Passover feast and be sacrificed. And his disciples asked him, "Are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel now?"
Okay.
So that implies to me that something was lost. And I don't know if that's the same thing that you're talking about. It seemed to them that the kingdom that belonged to Israel, that was promised to Israel, had been lost. And they're asking Messiah, who they thought, is he going to restore the kingdom to Israel now?
Actually, it reinforces what I just said.
Yes.
They felt that something in the physical world was missing. The expectancy was for something in the physical world to happen, not something spiritual. I think that the church moved to the spiritual side of things because they were expecting for things to happen now. They were sitting around, okay, so he's on the cross, he died, he resurrected, and they're sitting there going, okay, isn't he supposed to appear now in our time? So even the church had to move to the spiritual meaning that there's a kingdom to come, but when you die, you go up to heaven and you stay in this heaven until that time comes. Even there's theological differences here, but even in the church theology, and I hope it's not offensive I'm using the word church, but it's easier for me, the terminology, they also understood a lot of things supposed to happen in the physical plane and not necessarily think everything is spiritual. They believed in heaven and hell, but they also believed that in this very day, most Christians believe that something will happen on this physical plane as well. That hell will be here at least, or something like that. No, I don't know enough about Christian theology to be able to answer that, but from what I've seen throughout the years, it sounds as if there is something physical as well. But in overall, most scholars understand that what was going on, they were moving to more the spiritual side of things. Now, another interesting thing that was going on at this time is we start hearing about immersion for conversion to Judaism. At the same time, we start hearing about this practice that when people converted to become Jewish, they would go through full immersion as well. So even in the Jewish world, for this rebirth or this change to becoming a new person, becoming inside the structure of birth as a Jew or as an Israelite, you had to go through the bath as well. And there's actually several mentions. For example, Josephus mentions in Antiquities of the Jews, several places he mentions this king called Azitis or something like that, where he converted to Judaism and he had to go through full immersion as well. So we've seen overall everyone was doing this. Pharisees, Sadducees, early onset Christians, if we can even, they didn't really call themselves Christians, but people who followed that, everyone was basically doing it. But what's interesting is that this is purely a Jewish practice that then the church adopted into itself and started tweaking it for its own purposes until you reach a point where you just pour water over your head. But the reason pouring this water over your head, or those who just sprinkle some water over their head, the reason it does still count is because it's a symbolic practice, not the actual practice as mentioned in the Torah. A very interesting thing as well, I said I'll mention something about why also keeping pure at this time, and this is more or less we're coming to the end of it. A very interesting thing that was practiced as well in the Second Temple period were the chavurot, the groups, the teachers with their groups. So basically Yeshua had his own group as well. Yeshua had a grouping of 12 students who, as I said, the noise today is amazing. I might have to use this recording because this one might be too noisy. But it is Sukkot and we are sitting outside, so there's nothing I can do about it. The thing that we actually hear in this period are groups of people, 5, 6, and in the case of Yeshua, 12, but he did something different, so I'll explain that in a second, of teachers and their students. And if you were a student of one of these rabbis, you were pretty important in your society, that followed their teacher, and they kept a lot of the rituals of purity to eat their food as clean as possible. So they would do ritual baths, and they would avoid cemeteries, and they would avoid unclean things and so on. But these were usually done only by the elite. So if you were part of, why does Paul say he studied under Gamliel and so on? Why is he saying this? Why? Because he's trying to point out that he is an elite, that he is a part of like the most highest level of students that existed at the time. It wasn't just bragging. If you were part of it, you had bragging rights for life. And this is why, it's very suspicious that he says this, but he might have not been actually in the group itself, but he was a candidate. You had to go through be a candidate, and at one point you were joined in, but they always kept these groups very, very small. It's very similar to what the Essenes were doing, or the people of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They had candidates, but there the groups were very, very big, and you had to live inside these very, very strict rules. Here the rules weren't as strict, but what I find very intriguing is the group Yeshua was leading was probably an antithesis of this. First of all, it was much bigger, but he also allowed simple people into the group. So it suddenly dawned on me a couple of weeks ago when I was researching for this lecture that he was actually running, and he was trying to be more like with the people. Instead of saying we're going to be sectarian, we're going to join our own little group here and everyone's supposed to be out, he said, no, I want everyone in, and my symbol of this is, as being a teacher, is going around criticizing everyone. People don't understand that when he says to you, oh, woe to you Pharisees, you hypocrites, it's not a criticism of I'm against Pharisees are evil. The church did that. That's actually internal criticism, the same way we criticize one another when someone in the family or someone in your neighborhood is doing something wrong. It's not out of hatred, it's out of, listen, what you just did there is pure hypocrisy. When I tell my son you can't do this, and then I myself do it, my son goes, Dad, what was that? You just told me I'm not allowed to do that. So it's the same idea. It's internal criticism. It's not there to be vicious and violent. So I actually found it very interesting that he probably led a group of people that were an antithesis of the sectarianism and of the overemphasis of holier than thou, if I can use that term, that people were going around, including rabbis and so on. The problem was that they realized they can't keep all the rules of the Torah, so they moved away into this little sects. And he actually, some people might criticize me for saying positive things about Yeshua, because in our world he's like, this is evil incarnated. But in truth, when you read between the lines and you're a bit more objective, you kind of realize that what he was really doing, he was really trying to be for everyone. And that's something that's dawned on me suddenly. And also, I actually just read it yesterday when I was there. A lot of scholars agree with this idea. Yes?
Well, Christianity teaches that Yeshua was trying to do away with Torah when he was criticizing those Pharisees and those other religious leaders for the hypocrisy of not following Torah. which is the exact opposite of what Christianity teaches you that he was doing.
Exactly. So he was saying, okay, it's good that you're trying to keep the covenant. It's good that you're trying to be loyal to everything. But what you're doing is, again, you're turning into sects. It's going to destroy us. And you know what? I mean, I don't think he said it bluntly, but he probably meant it, and he was right. Destruction of Jerusalem came because the sects were not joined together. Everyone was fighting with one another. This guy went. There was a guy, for example, called Menachem, one of the failed messiahs of the period. A lot of people don't know about this, but there was several failed messiahs, and one of them was called Menachem. He actually declared himself king. He marched into the temple with the soldiers wearing armor and a crown and everything. A lot of people don't know this story. Well, loads of them. And everyone was fighting one another. It was only at the end when they realized they had to join forces, but it was too late. So what happened? Everything was destroyed. Everything collapsed. Everyone had to try to reconstruct themselves. The Christians had to go one way. Jews had to go another way. The Gentile Christians had to go a third way. The Jewish Christians, which sounds like an oxymoron, but this is what really they were. The Jews, people who were Jewish by descent, were also part of what's known as the Church of the Circumcised, because there were two churches competing with one another: the Church of the Nations and the Church of the Circumcised. And the Church of the Circumcised had to make a choice at one point, and they actually went with the Church of the Nations, and they abandoned their own brothers. And that actually happened during the Bar Kokhba revolt. Bar Kokhba, amongst church fathers, was notorious, and they hated him for one very simple reason. He turned around to the Christians, the Jews who were Christians, and he said to them, join us in this battle against the mutual enemy. And they refused for two reasons. A, because a lot of these enemies were actually Christians and they saw them as brothers. And second of all, helping Bar Kokhba meant that they admitted that he was a Messiah, which was something which meant that they denied Yeshua as Messiah. So they broke off. That the Bar Kokhba revolt there was more going on than people realized. It wasn't just the final fight against the Romans. There were actually several other revolts. There were revolts going on into the 7th century. The Samaritans, for example, revolted like 5 or 6 times. But the Bar Kokhba revolt was a big pivotal point for the Christian world, because that was when they realized we can't identify anymore with the Jews, because it's dangerous, but also because it meant that we had to deny Yeshua as Messiah, and they just went their own way. That was when they actually split. Prior to that, they were considered part of the synagogue. They joined the synagogues. Some of them moved towards the eastern side of the Jordan River. They were in what's known as the Hashemite kingdom of Transjordan. But there are a lot of them still. They came to the synagogues. You have interactions. There was a man called Jacob of Sechnin, I think, and he came to heal someone. Someone was bitten by a snake, and his father refused the healing because he was going to heal him in the name of Yeshua. And he said, I'd rather my son die than you heal in his name. But these were people who were part of the community. There was tension, but they were part of the community, and that's when they broke off. But these people, they carried on real baptism, if I use that term, real washing oneself, cleansing oneself in the Miqveh, and they slowly moved away because they joined the Church of the Nations. And the Church of the Nation made everything sacraments and symbols, and they started changing, basically perversing, but still kind of keeping somewhat true to the original practices they had prior to the Church Fathers and prior to everything that happened later on. Especially, they were very concerned with people practicing things that resembled Judaism. There were groups that were keeping Shabbat. There were groups who were keeping ritual purity. There were people who were keeping kosher. And the Church Fathers were very, very upset with this, because it was scaring them, because for a very long time, until around the 3rd century, more or less, 4th century, there was actually competition between Judaism and Christianity. Most of the world was pagan, and Jews and Christians were competing with one another. And then one of the things they had to do was basically distance themselves as much as they could from Judaism, which included keeping away from the ritual bath as well. Questions?
Judaism, I see as and probably nothing is, but Judaism, in my research, has been as it existed at that time, wasn't just biblicism. It was much more than simply biblicism.
It was a lot more.
Yeah.
If we start talking about the comparative cultural influences on one another, it's a very, very vast subject. There's an influence of, first we can't really talk about Judaism, it's Judaisms. There were several types. As Rivka Nir, Professor Rivka Nir put it to us in one of the classes, we can't talk about one Judaism. We have to talk about loads and loads of different types of Judaisms. And in truth, even today, we can't talk about one Judaism. I'm not talking about the split with the Reform and Conservative and so on. I'm talking about inside Orthodox Judaism itself. There are different types of Judaisms. The only thing is that we've overcome our sectarianism. We're actually able to work with one another and live side by side. Back then it was a bit more of a struggle, but they were able to live side by side as well. But yes, I mean, the influence of Zoroastrianism, of Hellenism as well. You read Philo of Alexandria. He was a Hellenized Jew, but he was also very orthodox in his way. So yes, the answer is most definitely yes.
And it seems to me like that is what Yeshua was dealing with. Here's the Word of God, and here's all this other stuff, and he's saying, I'm the one who understands how to obey the Word of God.
It's quite possible. I mean, I don't. There are places where you do see his argument with the way they kept Torah. There are a few places where you see it. Like for example, there was the whole story. They were working on the Sabbath and they were picking grain and everything. The argument there is not against keeping Sabbath. The argument there is over what does it mean to violate the Sabbath.
Right.
So he actually, it's very interesting. Flusa was the one who I read that he mentioned this. He said he's actually holding to an opinion that existed at the time that picking in the field and eating directly was not a violation of the Sabbath. It was only when you went out and you actually harvested that that's a violation of the Sabbath. Which is actually something. I had a discussion one day with a Karaite about this, and we kind of we were discussing this, and it was very similar. We're talking about, is the breaking of Sabbath connected to the actual action itself, or is there also a volume that's connected to the whole practice or the whole prohibition? And we kind of conclude there's a good chance that volume is also connected to it.
Well, what I've been told is that Mishnah 7:2, that's where picking the heart. That's where they're defining that as harvesting.
Yes.
When you pick the grain, and then when you take the sheath off. And,
yes.
And then that's what, I don't know what the word is, but they're just walking through a field cleaning and eating on the way, and
there's a vast difference between I'm picking an apple. I used with my friend with the whole thing with apple.
Yeah.
Difference between picking one apple just to eat it and picking apples.
Right.
Which is actual work. I mean, really a lot of scholars, like for example Weinfeld, he says that it seems to be that in the Bible, work was mostly what you did in the field. And this is why the Torah has to specifically also identify lighting fires as something which is forbidden, because work for most people were farmers. So either you worked on your farm or you worked in your fields, and that was work. So I actually came to the conclusion the definition of work is what you do for your profession, what you make money with. So the definitions are very difficult. I've been trying to define what exactly work is in biblical terms for years now. I've gone back and forth. There's entire recordings of me discussing this with people from different places, and we've never fully concluded. So I'm very conservative in what I define as work. I'm very, very careful with it. But going back to what you said, I mean, yes, I mean it's very difficult to really speak about one type of Judaism. There were arguments in between one another. Going to what you said as well, it's not abolishing Torah. He's actually arguing inside the structure of Judaism of the time, or Judaisms of the time.
Right.
Well, in another case, I don't know if it was a mikveh, but it was ceremonial washing.
Yeah.
He said, why do you and your guys not wash before you eat? And his response was, why do you put the traditions of men ahead of Torah?
So yeah, I mean, he's probably attacking first of all, washing your hands is something that they picked up from the Persians. The Torah does mention that a person who suffers from a certain problem is not allowed. It's called the ziva, which is basically a type of gonorrhea of sorts. They're not supposed to touch anything unless they wash their hands before. So we do find, the priest is supposed to wash their hands and feet before they go into the temple. So there is such a thing. But what they picked up from the Persians was this practice of washing your hands before you eat a regular meal. I need the greater context of what's going on there, because I've been asked about this quite a few times. He's probably attacking their, that they're putting this great emphasis. Everyone's going to wash their hands, but then he's saying, okay, you're washing your hands, but what about everything else in everyday life that you're not doing? That's probably the context. He's probably attacking the lack of keeping of Torah in other areas, and they're washing their hands with something the Torah never even mentions you have to do. I mean, I would wash my hands before I eat because, we know there are germs and everything, but back then they didn't understand this, so they're all rushing to wash their hands in these great when they go to weddings or before they eat and everything. It's a big, if you ever go to like a Jewish wedding, there are like entire lines, if it's an Orthodox wedding, entire lines of people washing their hands before they're eating. So it's a big thing. Probably was a big thing back then as well. But what's very interesting here is that he's not attacking anything specific. He's probably attacking just the overall idea of having to people just practicing these things and ignoring other things they have to do. There's also the criticism he talks about. They enlarge their phylacteries and extend their the tzitzit and everything. And they're trying to show off that look, I have one. When I go to the synagogue, I actually get funny looks because my phylacteries are very small, and they kind of vanish. When I used to have long hair, they used to vanish inside my hair. And my tzitzit, usually, I'm actually not wearing any because it's hot, so I'm sweating like you wouldn't believe. I guess this chair probably would have a wet stain on my back. Problem of strong men, we sweat all the time. But my tzitzit are very small as well. But today, you go places, they're looking for these big ones. Big tzitzit, so everyone can see what they. Well, I don't think actually it's because they want everyone to see that they're wearing tzitzit. I think it's mostly because they just want to make sure that it's there and it's the right size and there's nothing going on wrong with it. But back then they probably were doing this to show off.
Well, they were clearly. If you look at Matthew 23, and he just gives them a scathing rebuke over and over again. Woe to you, Pharisees, hypocrites! Whitewashed tombs. I mean, he's calling some nasty names.
You know why he says whitewashed tombs? You know what's the whole deal with whitewashed tombs? So whitewashed tomb.
Dead bones.
So whitewashed tomb was actually something very practical. When they did pilgrimage, like for example during Sukkot, what they did is they marked the tombs on the roads. If there are any tombs on the roads on the way, they marked the tombs with a whitewash, so you could see them. So you wouldn't like go near them. So you wouldn't go near them, because the process of purifying oneself from contact with the dead is a 7-day process. So they used to go around all over the country and they would divide the districts and they will paint them. They actually paint. This is embedded in real everyday life. I actually wrote an article about this and people were like, wow, we never thought about it. It's a real thing. Mm-hmm. So whitewashing is literally washing something with a whitewash.
That makes sense, because if you're trying to go to Jerusalem to celebrate Sukkot, you want to stay away from this.
Exactly. And white is, everything here is like brown and yellow and everything. There's something white, it sticks out, especially if it's a very white.
Is it possible that he's actually dealing with knowledge or Gnosticism when they're telling him, hey, you're not washing your hands, and then he makes it clear that there's some dust or whatever is on the bread that they were eating gets into your body, it's not going to make you dirty.
That would be an excellent question for a New Testament scholar. I wouldn't know.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
It's an interesting direction, but the question is what exactly. It's a problem of defining what exactly the criticism is.
I have a question about the mikvahs.
Yeah.
Because you went over the history over them really well, but you didn't really go anywhere with it specifically as to what now. So I guess my question is about mikvahs is what do the modern Hebrew people do and what are they actually supposed to be doing?
Okay, so actually the end of the lecture does contain this. I decided to skip it because I was also looking at the time. But yeah, I mean, fine. I
got really curious because you did a good job.
I left you hanging because I wanted you to discover it by yourself. I was actually debating because I was actually looking at time. We've been going for an hour and a half now, but perfectly fine. So today, Because
You can give me a short answer.
you should see that the end section here, the lecture actually contains that. So today, what we actually find is, first of all, I mentioned in the beginning, the mikveh is used in practical life, mostly when women are done with their menstrual cycle. But there is a culture here in Israel for men to go to the mikveh as well. And what we find is men going to the mikveh, in the morning before they go to prayer. Very commonly, there's a practice to go to the mikveh just before Yom Kippurim, just before Day of Atonement. There's a practice to go to the mikveh on the night of Shavuot, of what's known as Pentecost, I think it's called. So it is alive and kicking, and it's practiced to this very day. The more severe side of it is when women have to go, because the purification is actually for Torah commandment. You also have, there are certain excretions that you have from your body that a lot of people want to keep themselves clean from it. So, for example, there are a lot of people after having relations, they'll go to the mikveh because that's an impurity as well. They don't expect their wives to go because you're going to run there every week or something, whatever the frequency is. But the violation of laying with a woman who's unclean, and the uncleanness doesn't stop by the bleeding stopping, she has to go through the mikveh, is much more severe. So the restrictions are more serious. They have to have nothing on their body. They have to take off all the jewelry. They have to go wash themselves prior to the actual immersion in the water. Usually, actually a couple of weeks ago, they changed the rules here in Israel. It used to be that when you went, you had to have a woman supervising, making sure the entire body is inside. With men, there's no supervision. It's not considered to be a purification for anything specific, but unless you go to the Temple Mount, there are groups of people who go to the Temple Mount, then they go through the mikveh. You also have in conversions as well. Today in the Orthodox conversion, even conservative conversion, the person has to go through a mikveh. If it's a woman, it's only a mikveh. If it's a man, it's also circumcision. I think the mikveh is done after the circumcision. Yeah, after the circumcision, it's circumcised, and that mikveh as well. They go in. It's again full immersion. Your entire body's in. That's really more or less where it all is. There are Hasidic movements, because there's a difference between ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic. People confuse them. In the Hasidic world, there's a great emphasis on going through the mikveh, purifying yourself for extra cleanliness, for extra holiness as well. There's very similar to what we actually hear with the Essenes. We're actually seeing history repeat itself. You go through the mikveh, and Kabbalists, for example, it's even worse. Kabbalists have this whole thing of dipping, 600 and something times for extra spirit and things like that. So we do see some piece of history repeating itself. But in a nutshell, that's mostly what you see. And there are, but it's the most important part of it today when you hear is Taharat Mishpacha, which is for the woman to go to the mikveh after the menstrual cycle. Yes?
Where and for is that?
It would be, so it's very interesting. So in Leviticus 15, it describes all the different impurities that are fluids that come out of the body. But what's interesting, it only mentions with the male gonorrhea, because gonorrhea is like an overall term for it. It's not really gonorrhea, but it only mentions washing there. So the understanding is that that produces a prototype for everything else, which is not uncommon in the Torah. Torah kind of keeps everything very short and tight. So you mention that, and then you have to understand that for all impurities like this, you have to go through immersion. But what you also have is today, there's, as I mentioned earlier, the whole ice thing and so on. You actually, you go to these places, and there's actually special gutters on the roof to collect rainwater. And they put them into these containers. Now today, the mikveh is constructed the same way the Pharisees would. So you have all these pools. That picture I showed, the second picture I showed you, these extra pools and everything. That's more or less it. I mean, the only, as I said, in a nutshell, the only practical side today of actual real Torah practice is the nidah. or any bleeding a woman might have, because remember, there's bleeding for this menstrual cycle, but there can also be bleeding outside of the menstrual cycle, which also requires 7 days of waiting with no blood and so on. You can read the verses in Leviticus. That's the only one that's actually really for it. Temple Mount is a very small group of people that do this, but for there it's also required. I hold that it is required. We don't have sacrifices, so there's no need to be pure. We don't eat tithes anymore. I mean, actually, in truth, you can go in a debate if you have to be pure, clean or unclean for if you can be unclean for tithe, but there is for the tithe for the priest, because what happens, how tithing works is you give. There's a tulma, which is not a tithe. It's an uplifting. It doesn't give any specific amount in the Torah that you give as almost like a sacrifice. So a Kohen cannot eat that today because they have to be completely clean. The tithe, what's really a tithe, which is the 10th, you give to a Levite, like a person like me. By descent, I'm a Levite. It's a family tradition. We're also registered in the Great Synagogue of London and in the rabbinate here in Israel as Levites, so it's also official. You give that to a Levite, and the Levite is supposed to take out of that a 10th and give it to the Kohen again. But that 10th again, they have to be pure as well to eat that. So we don't use that either. But so really, it's because there's no temple, it's been narrowed down. Karaites do hold to the idea of keeping pure as much as you can, because as I said in the beginning, some people don't divide between the camp in the desert and everyday life of today. So they want to say you have to keep pure all the time. In the Karaite community, women or people who are unclean, women who are in their menstrual cycle, or men who are unclean, don't go into the synagogue, for example. You also have there's some interesting stuff that they have, like for example, if you sit on a chair that someone unclean sat on under certain rules, if you sit on that chair, you become unclean. So I actually knew a guy who had a sheet that he would put on the chairs in his car. So if anyone sits on it, at least they're not making his chair unclean, and so on. So in the Karaite world, they take it more extended. Samaritans, I think, is less. But what's very interesting also the contrast of the practices. So in Rabbinic Judaism, you have to go to a Miqveh to actually dip. Karaites are fine with a shower. As I mentioned in the beginning, rachatz is really just to wash yourself like in a shower. Samaritans require full immersion, but it can also be a bath in your house. So one of the Samaritans that I know actually told me that they have a booming industry of jacuzzis in their community because they use them for the full immersion. So they have like an in-between case. It's a full immersion. If you ask me what I think they practice in biblical times, a shower would be enough. But I wouldn't practice it because I'm part of Orthodox Judaism. But from a biblical studies perspective, a shower would be enough. If you have a swimming pool in your home, that's fine. That works as well. The only thing is as follows. This is one of my objections to the rabbinic mikveh. It's a good thing you brought this up. There's more points I can bring up. I can go on for hours, by the way. I'm a compulsive talker. I'm also a teacher, so it goes together. The interesting thing is that the Torah actually mentions that when the zav, I want to use that term, zav is the person who has the excretion of fluid which is not semen. Is that offensive to use that term either? Okay, I don't know. Some people, she's going yes, she's going no. Oh, okay. So it's not 100% clear exactly what this is. Some kind of a disease. It's not a sexual disease. It's some dysfunction in the reproductive organs, and what's interesting there, it uses the term mayim chayim, living water. And we talked about this in the car. My understanding of living water is drinkable water. In Rabbinic Judaism, it's talked about water that flows, water that's alive, that moves around everything. So he needs to go dip in a river or an ocean or something. My understanding is that mayim chayim is actually drinkable water. And how do I conclude it's this? when you go through the purification process for a leper, it says that the Kohen takes living water and places it in a vessel, and then he slaughters the bird onto that. In the vessel itself, it's still called living water. I mean, if living water is moving water, why is it? So they're going to say, oh, it's still living water because it came from a living source. No, but you can't use that adjective of living when it's no longer in its body. So I understand living water is drinkable water. Why? There are a lot of places where the water is not drinkable. You can't use it. So if something does not sustain life, how can it bring you back into life? Going back to everything was in the beginning, life and the opposite of death and being birthed through water and everything. Anything else? Okay, so let me stop mine. I'm going to listen to this and see how bad it is.